What would make a family abandon its home, possessions, language, and everything familiar to cross an ocean toward a country it had never seen? Between 1880 and 1924, more than 2 million Jews left Eastern Europe for the United States. They carried worn suitcases, precious family photographs, religious traditions, and a powerful hope that life in America might offer something increasingly difficult to find in their homeland: safety, dignity, and the freedom to shape their own future. Most came from territories controlled by the Russian Empire, including regions that are now part of Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and Belarus. There, Jewish communities faced anti-Semitic restrictions, economic hardship, political instability, and waves of organized violence known as pogroms. Opportunities to own land, enter universities, or practice certain professions were severely limited. For countless families, emigration was not simply an adventure or the pursuit of wealth. It was a painful decision made under pressure, often involving permanent separation from relatives who remained behind. Their journey led through crowded railway stations, unfamiliar European ports, and weeks aboard ships crossing the Atlantic. Yet reaching America was only the beginning. At Ellis Island, and in neighborhoods such as New York's Lower East Side, these immigrants encountered exhausting labor, overcrowded housing, cultural conflict, and the challenge of building a new identity between two worlds. This documentary follows their extraordinary migration from persecution and poverty in Eastern Europe to the creation of vibrant Jewish American communities, and examines how their search for a new beginning helped transform the United States. 1. Persecution and poverty in Eastern Europe. In the final decades of the 19th century, millions of Jews lived across the western territories of the Russian Empire, including areas that today belong to Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, and Moldova. Many resided in small towns known as shtetls, where Jewish communities had developed their own schools, synagogues, markets, charitable organizations, and cultural traditions. Yiddish was the language of everyday life for most families, while Hebrew remained central to religious study. These communities possessed strong social bonds, but they existed within a political system that treated Jews as a separate and frequently unwanted population. Their freedom of movement, access to education, and ability to choose occupations were restricted by imperial law. Most Jews in the Russian Empire were required to live within a vast region called the Pale of Settlement. Created at the end of the 18th century, it prevented them from settling permanently in many other parts of the empire, including major cities outside the designated zone. Only certain merchants, professionals, university graduates, and skilled workers could obtain permission to live beyond its borders. This policy concentrated millions of people in towns and districts where employment and housing were already scarce. As the Jewish population grew, competition for limited economic opportunities intensified, making it increasingly difficult for families to escape poverty. Economic life inside the Pale of Settlement was uncertain, because Jews had historically faced restrictions on owning or working agricultural land. Many depended on commerce, tailoring, shoemaking, carpentry, transportation, and other small trades. Some operated modest shops or sold goods in local markets, while others worked as traveling merchants between villages. Industrialization and the expansion of railways gradually transformed these traditional occupations. Factory-made products replaced the work of many artisans. Larger commercial networks weakened small businesses, and rural customers often had little money to spend. A family's income could disappear quickly when a harvest failed, a market closed, or new regulations disrupted local trade. Poverty was visible throughout many Jewish districts. Several generations sometimes lived together in small houses, and families depended heavily on every member's labor. Children might assist in workshops, deliver goods, or help their parents at market stalls. Community organizations provided food, clothing, medical assistance, and support for widows and orphans. But these institutions could not solve the deeper economic crisis. The image of the prosperous Jewish merchant, frequently promoted by anti-Semitic propaganda, had little connection to the lives of most Eastern European Jews. In reality, large numbers lived as struggling artisans, laborers, and small traders with few savings and almost no protection against hardship. Political repression made these economic difficulties even more severe. After Tsar Alexander II was assassinated in 1881, false rumors and accusations blamed Jews collectively for Russia's wider political instability. A series of pogroms, organized attacks against Jewish communities, spread through parts of the empire. Homes, shops, and synagogues were damaged, while local authorities sometimes reacted slowly or failed to protect residents. The violence demonstrated that Jewish families could not depend on the state to defend their lives or property. Even communities that were not directly attacked understood that similar events could reach them with little warning. Instead of protecting Jewish citizens, the imperial government introduced additional restrictions. The temporary regulations of 1882, commonly known as the May Laws, limited Jewish settlement in rural areas and placed new pressure on commercial activity and property rights. These measures affected families that depended on trade with surrounding villages and forced some residents into already overcrowded towns. Other regulations restricted participation in certain professions and government institutions. Anti-Semitism was therefore not limited to personal prejudice. It was reinforced through laws that shaped where Jews could live, how they could earn money, and which opportunities remained available to their children. Education offered a possible route out of poverty, but it was also restricted. Jewish families placed great value on learning, and many young people hoped to enter secondary schools or universities to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, or engineers. Yet quotas limited the number of Jewish students accepted by many institutions. A talented student could pass the required examinations and still be refused because the permitted number of Jewish pupils had already been reached. For families that had sacrificed money and years of effort to educate a child, such exclusion sent a clear message: ability and determination would not necessarily overcome the barriers imposed by the state. Military service created another source of anxiety. Jewish men were subject to conscription in the Russian Imperial Army, where they could face discrimination and lengthy separation from their families. For poor households, losing a young worker could also mean losing an essential source of income. Although military obligations affected many groups across the empire, Jewish communities often experienced them within a broader system of unequal treatment. The possibility of conscription, combined with restricted employment and recurring instability, persuaded many young men to leave before they had established families. Some traveled first and later sent money for parents, wives, siblings, or children to follow. The decision to emigrate was strengthened by letters from relatives already living in the United States. These letters described wages that appeared enormous compared with earnings in Eastern Europe, as well as the possibility of changing jobs, moving freely, and practicing Judaism without imperial restrictions. The letters did not always reveal the overcrowded apartments, exhausting factory work, or discrimination immigrants encountered in America. Even so, they provided evidence that another kind of life was possible. A steamship ticket sent by a relative could transform a distant dream into a practical escape route, creating chains of migration from individual towns to specific American neighborhoods. Leaving Eastern Europe was rarely a simple rejection of the homeland. Emigrants departed from places where their families had lived for generations and where religious customs, memories, and community relationships shaped every part of life. Many believed they would never see their parents, grandparents, or childhood homes again. Yet remaining meant accepting poverty, restricted rights, uncertain protection, and limited futures for their children. Between 1880 and 1924, This combination of persecution and economic desperation pushed more than 2 million Eastern European Jews toward the United States. Their migration began not with confidence about what awaited them in America, but with the growing conviction that remaining where they were had become even more dangerous and uncertain. 2. The difficult journey across the Atlantic. For an Eastern European Jewish family, reaching America involved far more than purchasing a steamship ticket and boarding a vessel. The journey usually began in a small town, hundreds or even thousands of kilometers from the nearest major port. Travelers first had to sell possessions, obtain documents, exchange money, and decide what could fit inside a few bags. Clothing, family photographs, religious books, candlesticks, and small household objects became physical connections to the lives they were leaving behind. Everything else, including homes, workshops, furniture, and familiar streets, had to be abandoned or entrusted to relatives. The departure itself was often the most painful moment. Emigration frequently divided families because the cost of sending everyone at once was too high. A father or an older son might travel first, find employment in the United States, and save enough money to purchase tickets for the others. Months or years could pass before the family was reunited, and there was no guarantee that the plan would succeed. At railway stations, parents said goodbye to children they might never see again, while emigrants left behind elderly relatives who were unable or unwilling to endure the journey. Their hope for a better future was inseparable from the knowledge that part of their former life was ending permanently. Many emigrants traveled by train through the Russian Empire, Germany, or Austria-Hungary toward ports such as Hamburg, Bremen, Antwerp, Rotterdam, and Liverpool. Others departed through Baltic ports such as Libau, now Liepaja, in Latvia. The railway journey could take several days and required repeated transfers through unfamiliar cities. Travelers who spoke only Yiddish or a regional language often struggled to understand signs, schedules, and official instructions. They were vulnerable to dishonest ticket agents, thieves, and middlemen who demanded additional payments or promised routes that did not exist. Crossing an international border presented another obstacle. Passports and exit documents were difficult for some Jews to obtain, particularly for young men concerned about military obligations. Officials inspected papers, questioned travelers, and could prevent anyone with incomplete documentation from continuing. Shipping companies also examined passengers before allowing them to proceed, because they could be required to return immigrants rejected by American authorities. A family that had already sold its property and traveled for days might discover that a minor problem with a document could threaten the entire journey. In major port cities, emigrants sometimes waited days or weeks for their ships. Hamburg became one of the most important departure points for Eastern European migrants. The Hamburg-America line eventually created a large emigration complex, later known as Ballenstadt, where passengers could sleep, eat, undergo medical examinations, and wait for departure. These facilities offered organization and some protection, but they also separated emigrants from the surrounding city and placed them under strict supervision. Every examination carried the fear that illness or an official decision could stop the journey before the Atlantic crossing had even begun. Most Jewish emigrants traveled in steerage, the least expensive section of the steamship. During the earlier years of mass migration, steerage accommodations were located in crowded lower areas of the vessel, with rows of bunks and little privacy. Entire families slept close to strangers from many countries, surrounded by luggage and the constant noise of the engines. Ventilation could be poor, and passengers had limited access to washing facilities. Later regulations improved conditions on some ships, but the difference between steerage and the comfortable cabins occupied by wealthier passengers remained enormous. Daily life aboard the ship was physically exhausting. The movement of the vessel caused widespread seasickness, especially during storms, while crowded accommodations allowed illnesses to spread rapidly. Food was basic and unfamiliar, and observant Jewish passengers faced the additional difficulty of maintaining religious dietary practices. Some shipping companies began providing kosher meals or separate utensils as Jewish migration increased. Although the quality varied considerably, families often carried bread, dried food, or other provisions from Europe. But these supplies could not last throughout a delayed voyage. Despite the discomfort, passengers attempted to create a temporary community aboard the ship. People shared information about American cities, discussed relatives already living there, and tried to interpret the questions they expected immigration officers to ask. Religious travelers organized prayers when conditions permitted, while parents worked to keep children calm and occupied. Those who had previously made the crossing sometimes offered advice, although rumors and misinformation were common. For many passengers, the voyage was their first close contact with people from other regions, languages, and religious traditions. A steamship crossing from a European port to New York generally lasted between 1 and 2 weeks, depending on the route, weather, vessel, and period. During those days, the ocean separated passengers from everything familiar, while America existed mainly through stories and imagination. Some expected immediate prosperity, while others understood that factory work and crowded housing awaited them. Nearly everyone feared rejection at the American border, a medical condition, insufficient money, or suspicion that a traveler might become dependent on public assistance could lead to detention and possible return to Europe. When the outline of New York finally appeared, passengers gathered on deck to see the harbor and the Statue of Liberty. The sight represented freedom and possibility, but it did not mean that they had officially entered the country. First and second class travelers were usually inspected aboard the ship, while steerage passengers were transferred to ferries and taken to the federal immigration station. After days of difficult travel and years of planning, Eastern European Jewish immigrants now faced another decisive test: the inspections and questioning at Ellis Island that would determine whether their search for a new beginning could continue. 3. Ellis Island and the gateway to America. For millions of immigrants arriving between 1892 and 1924, Ellis Island became the symbolic gateway to the United States. Located in New York Harbor, near the Statue of Liberty, the federal immigration station processed passengers who had traveled in steerage aboard transatlantic steamships. Eastern European Jews arrived exhausted from weeks of travel, carrying documents, small bundles, and the addresses of relatives written on pieces of paper. Although they could already see Manhattan, they were not yet legally admitted. The final decision rested with American inspectors inside the enormous immigration complex. Ellis Island opened as a federal immigration station on January 1, 1892. The original wooden buildings were destroyed by fire in 1897, and a new fireproof main building opened in 1900. Its central space, known as the Registry Room or Great Hall, became one of the most recognizable places in the history of American immigration. On busy days, thousands of people moved through its corridors, staircases, inspection lines, and waiting areas. Announcements in unfamiliar languages, crying children, uniformed officials, and crowds searching for directions created an overwhelming environment for newcomers. The inspection process began before immigrants entered the Great Hall. Doctors watched passengers as they climbed the stairs, looking for signs of physical difficulty, illness, or exhaustion that might require closer examination. Medical officers conducted brief inspections and marked some passengers for additional evaluation. American law excluded people with certain contagious diseases and conditions believed to prevent them from supporting themselves. For immigrants who had invested their savings in the voyage, even a minor medical concern could produce intense fear, because rejection might mean separation from relatives or return to Europe. Families worried especially about being divided during these examinations. If one member was detained for observation, the others sometimes had to decide whether to wait or continue without them. Children could become separated temporarily in the confusion, while elderly passengers struggled to follow rapidly changing instructions. Detention did not automatically mean deportation. Many immigrants were eventually admitted after further examination or after relatives provided assistance. Nevertheless, hours or days of uncertainty could feel endless to people who did not understand the system or know what officials had written in their records. After the medical inspection came the legal examination. Inspectors compared each person with information on the ship's passenger manifest, which had been prepared at the European port of departure. They asked questions about age, occupation, marital status, money, final destination, previous visits to America, and whether someone was waiting for the traveler. Immigrants also had to demonstrate that they were unlikely to become dependent on public assistance. A correct answer could move a passenger forward, while uncertainty or contradictory information could lead to additional questioning before a special board. Language created one of the greatest difficulties. Many Eastern European Jewish immigrants spoke Yiddish, Russian, Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, or other regional languages, but little or no English. Ellis Island employed interpreters, and immigrant aid organizations also provided assistance, but communication remained imperfect. A frightened passenger could misunderstand a question, pronounce an American address incorrectly, or give an answer that appeared suspicious. Officials were expected to make quick decisions, and the future of an entire family could depend on a short conversation conducted in an unfamiliar setting. Contrary to a popular myth, immigration officials at Ellis Island did not routinely replace immigrants' surnames with more American-sounding names. Inspectors worked from passenger manifests created before the ships left Europe, and generally checked identities against those records. Names were sometimes spelled differently because several alphabets and languages were involved, and immigrants occasionally adopted simpler or more Americanized names later. Those changes usually occurred after admission, during employment, education, naturalization, or everyday life. Not because an Ellis Island official spontaneously renamed them. Most immigrants passed through Ellis Island in a matter of hours and were admitted, but the possibility of exclusion shaped the entire experience. Passengers could be detained because of medical concerns, insufficient funds, missing relatives, unclear employment plans, or questions about their legal eligibility. Cases that couldn't be settled immediately went before a board of special inquiry. Jewish charitable organizations sometimes helped contact family members, provide information, or appeal decisions. Only a relatively small proportion of arrivals were ultimately denied entry, but for those affected, the consequences were devastating. For immigrants who received permission to enter, the final moments at Ellis Island were practical rather than ceremonial. They exchanged European money, purchased railway tickets, retrieved their luggage, and searched for relatives in designated meeting areas. One famous location became known as the Kissing Post because families were reunited there after long separations. Some newcomers continued by train to cities such as Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, Baltimore, or Cleveland. Many others boarded ferries for Manhattan, where relatives or representatives of immigrant organizations waited to guide them through the city. Passing through Ellis Island did not immediately turn frightened travelers into secure American citizens. It simply allowed them to begin the next and often more difficult phase of migration. They still had to find housing, obtain employment, learn English, and understand a society very different from the towns they had left behind. Yet the moment they departed the island carried enormous meaning. After persecution, poverty, border inspections, and the Atlantic crossing, Eastern European Jewish immigrants had entered the United States. Beyond the harbor stood New York's Lower East Side, where they would build one of the most influential immigrant communities in American history. 4. Building a new life on the Lower East Side. For hundreds of thousands of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, Manhattan's Lower East Side became their first home in America. By the beginning of the 20th century, it was one of the most densely populated urban districts in the world. Streets such as Orchard, Hester, Rivington, and Delancey were filled with tenement buildings, workshops, synagogues, market stalls, and pushcarts. Yiddish could be heard everywhere, allowing newcomers to buy food, find housing, and search for employment without immediately speaking English. The neighborhood offered familiarity and community, but it also exposed families to severe overcrowding and poverty. Most immigrant families rented rooms in tenement buildings designed to hold as many residents as possible on small plots of land. Several people often shared a narrow apartment with limited ventilation, little natural light, and inadequate sanitation. Earlier tenements might have only a few windows, while toilets and water facilities were shared by multiple families. Rooms served several purposes. A kitchen during the day could become a bedroom at night, and living spaces were sometimes converted into small workshops. Housing reforms gradually improved building standards, but landlords frequently resisted changes that reduced their profits. Finding employment was the most urgent priority. Many Jewish immigrants entered New York's rapidly expanding garment industry because tailoring and textile work required skills they already possessed. Men worked as cutters, pressers, and machine operators, while women and teenage girls were commonly employed as sewing machine operators and finishers. Some worked in factories, while others produced clothing in small workshops or inside tenement apartments. The hours were long, the pay was low, and workers were usually paid according to the number of pieces they completed rather than the time they spent working. The garment trade became associated with the sweating system, in which contractors competed by lowering production costs and demanding faster work. Entire families sometimes contributed to the same order, sewing buttons, finishing seams, or preparing garments late into the evening. Workers had little protection against sudden dismissal, unpaid wages, or unsafe conditions. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911, which claimed the lives of 146 workers, many of them young Jewish and Italian immigrant women, exposed the consequences of inadequate safety regulations. The disaster strengthened demands for factory inspections, fire protections, and improved labor laws. Immigrant women played a central role in sustaining both families and the neighborhood economy. In addition to factory employment, they managed households, cared for children, prepared food, and sometimes accepted sewing or laundry work at home. Some operated small stores, rented beds to boarders, or sold goods from pushcarts to supplement the family income. Their wages could determine whether a household paid rent or purchased enough food. Employment also gave some women greater independence, but it created new tensions over traditional expectations, family authority, and women's changing position within American society. The Lower East Side developed a vast commercial world shaped by immigrant needs. Pushcart markets sold vegetables, fish, clothing, household objects, and familiar foods at prices working families could afford. Bakeries produced rye bread and bagels, while delicatessens and small groceries offered products that followed Jewish dietary traditions. Tailors, printers, cobblers, photographers, and booksellers opened businesses along crowded streets. These establishments allowed immigrants to earn a living while serving customers who shared their language and customs, creating an economy that functioned almost like a city within the larger city. Community organizations helped newcomers survive emergencies that could otherwise destroy a family's stability. Immigrants from the same European town often created mutual aid societies known as Landsmannschaften. Members contributed small amounts of money that could provide medical assistance, burial services, loans, or support during unemployment. Synagogues, charitable institutions, settlement houses, and labor organizations offered additional help. These networks were especially important before government welfare programs became widely available. Assistance usually came from relatives, neighbors, religious groups, and associations built by immigrants themselves. Religious life changed significantly in the American environment. Small congregations established synagogues inside converted stores, apartments, and larger purpose-built structures. Some immigrants maintained strict observance, while others gradually adjusted religious practices to factory schedules and urban life. Working on Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, created a difficult conflict between economic survival and tradition. Reform, conservative, Orthodox, and secular Jewish movements competed to define what Jewish identity should mean in America. For many families, religion remained important, but it was increasingly combined with language, shared history, food, and community membership. The Lower East Side also became a remarkable center of Yiddish culture. Newspapers reported American events, explained immigration laws, advertised jobs, and answered questions from newcomers attempting to understand their new country. Yiddish theaters presented dramas, comedies, and musical productions about family conflict, migration, poverty, and cultural change. Libraries, lecture halls, political clubs, and literary societies gave working-class residents access to education and public debate. This cultural world allowed immigrants to preserve connections to Eastern Europe, while creating something new and distinctly Jewish American. Children often experienced the fastest transformation. They attended American public schools, learned English, adopted local clothing and customs, and sometimes translated for parents who could not communicate with landlords, employers, or government officials. Education offered a path beyond factory labor, but it could also create distance between generations. Parents feared that their children would abandon religious traditions, while young people sometimes felt embarrassed by the language or customs of the old world. Over time, successful families moved to Brooklyn, the Bronx, or other cities. But the Lower East Side remained the foundation of their American story, a place where poverty and exploitation existed beside extraordinary cultural creativity, collective organization, and hope for social advancement. 5. The end of mass immigration and its lasting legacy. By the early 20th century, the enormous migration from Eastern and Southern Europe had transformed American cities. New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, and other urban centers became home to growing Jewish, Italian, Polish, Greek, and Slavic communities. Their arrival supplied labor to expanding industries and enriched American culture. But it also produced a powerful political reaction. Many native-born Americans feared that the country's language, religion, and social order were being permanently changed. These anxieties strengthened a nativist movement that portrayed the new immigrants as culturally incompatible with the United States. Eastern European Jews encountered anti-Semitism alongside this broader hostility toward immigration. Newspapers, political organizations, and influential public figures repeated stereotypes that presented Jewish newcomers as dangerous, unassimilable, or responsible for urban poverty and political radicalism. Jewish workers were criticized for participating in socialist organizations and labor strikes, while successful Jewish merchants and professionals were attacked for supposedly gaining too much influence. These contradictory accusations revealed that prejudice wasn't based on immigrants' actual behavior. Whether they remained poor or achieved economic success, they could still be treated as outsiders. The federal government gradually introduced measures intended to reduce immigration. The Immigration Act of 1917 required most adult immigrants to pass a literacy test and expanded the categories of people who could be excluded. Supporters claimed the test would improve the quality of immigration, but its practical purpose was to restrict arrivals from regions whose populations had fewer educational opportunities. Although many Eastern European Jews possessed high levels of literacy in Yiddish, Hebrew, Russian, or Polish, the law represented a major change in American policy. The country was moving away from relatively open European immigration toward a system of deliberate selection and exclusion. The First World War had already interrupted transatlantic travel, making civilian migration dangerous and difficult. After the war, political fear intensified during the First Red Scare, when strikes, revolutionary movements, and social unrest were frequently blamed on foreign-born radicals. Because some Jewish immigrants participated in socialist, anarchist, or labor organizations, entire communities could be viewed with suspicion. Government raids, arrests, and deportations reinforced the belief that immigration needed to be controlled. The public debate increasingly connected national security with restricting people from Eastern and Southern Europe. In 1921, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act, establishing numerical limits based on nationality. The law permitted annual immigration from each European country, according to a percentage of that nationality already recorded in the United States. Although presented as a neutral mathematical system, it favored countries whose populations had arrived in large numbers during earlier periods. Immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe declined sharply, while Northern and Western European countries received more generous quotas. The United States had begun to define who could enter according to an officially constructed ethnic hierarchy. The most decisive restriction came with the Immigration Act of 1924, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act. It created an even stricter quota system and used earlier population data that heavily favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe. Countries in Eastern Europe received limited quotas that were far smaller than the number of people hoping to leave. For Jewish families, the law ended the era when relatives already in America could reasonably expect to bring over parents, siblings, or children. Migration networks built across 4 decades were suddenly interrupted by federal policy. The consequences extended far beyond immigration statistics. Families remained separated across the Atlantic, sometimes permanently, because the available quota numbers could not meet demand. The restrictions became especially tragic in the following decades, when European Jews searching for refuge from escalating Nazi persecution discovered that legal entry into the United States was extremely limited. The quota system was not created with knowledge of the Holocaust that would follow, but its continued enforcement prevented many endangered people from finding safety in America. A policy designed during the nativism of the 1920s shaped life and death possibilities during the next European crisis. For those who had arrived before the restrictions, life continued to change. Many Jewish families gradually left the crowded Lower East Side for neighborhoods in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and other parts of New York. Others established communities across the country. The children of immigrants entered universities, professional occupations, public service, business, journalism, entertainment, and the arts. Progress was not immediate or universal, and discrimination remained present in employment, housing, universities, hotels, and private organizations. Nevertheless, the opportunities available to the second generation often exceeded anything their parents could have imagined in Eastern Europe. The immigrants also left a powerful institutional and cultural legacy. They established synagogues, hospitals, schools, libraries, charities, labor unions, newspapers, theaters, and mutual aid organizations. Yiddish literature and theater influenced American entertainment, while Jewish musicians, comedians, filmmakers, writers, and intellectuals became important voices in national culture. Foods associated with Eastern European Jewish life entered the everyday landscape of American cities. More significantly, immigrant experiences strengthened campaigns for workplace safety, fair wages, educational access, civil rights, and assistance for vulnerable families. The mass migration of Eastern European Jews between 1880 and 1924 was therefore more than a movement of people from one continent to another. It was a transformation created through loss, courage, labor, adaptation, and conflict between generations. The United States offered safety and opportunity, but immigrants had to build those opportunities within crowded neighborhoods and unequal institutions. Their descendants reshaped American society while preserving memories of the communities left behind. The immigration restrictions of 1924 closed one historic gateway, but they could not erase what the newcomers had already created: a lasting Jewish-American presence born from the search for dignity, security, and a new beginning.